Physicists have known sin, and this is a knowledge which they cannot lose. Oppenheimer wasn't speaking about religion. He was speaking about responsibility. In that moment, science stopped being neutral. It stopped being innocent. Because when knowledge gains the power to end the world, it no longer belongs to curiosity alone. It becomes a burden humanity may never set down. 1. Now I am become death, recognition, not poetry. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another. The line most people remember from Oppenheimer's life is often treated like a dramatic success, a quote chosen for shock value. But for him, it wasn't metaphor or ego, it was recognition. In that moment after Trinity, Oppenheimer reached not for science, but for philosophy, because science alone no longer felt sufficient to describe what had just happened. When you see something that is technically sweet, you go ahead and do it, and you argue about what to do about it only after you have had your technical success. That last sentence is the warning. Oppenheimer wasn't condemning science, he was exposing its reflex. Discovery first, consequences later. The Gita quote wasn't about destruction alone, it was about inevitability. Once the knowledge existed, the choice had already narrowed. Science had crossed into history, and history would not let it step back. 2. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the end of scientific innocence. Trinity proved the bomb could work. Hiroshima and Nagasaki proved something far more unsettling, that it would be used. In August 1945, nuclear physics left the laboratory and entered human memory. By the end of that year, an estimated 140,000 people were dead in Hiroshima and around 70,000 in Nagasaki, mostly civilians, cities erased not by soldiers, but by calculations finally given shape. What had once lived on chalkboards became an irreversible fact. For Oppenheimer, this was the moment science stopped being abstract and became unbearable. Publicly, he spoke with restraint. The atomic bomb made the prospect of future war unendurable. It brought home to us that we were living in a world in which war could mean the destruction of nations. Privately, the tone was different. When Oppenheimer met President Truman after the bombings, he expressed some emotion. "I feel I have blood on my hands." Truman dismissed the remark, but the line matters because it shows the shift. This was no longer about success or failure. It was about responsibility that could not be shared, denied, or undone. This is where scientific innocence ends. Not because knowledge was evil, but because its consequences were no longer containable. War was no longer about victory or defeat. It was about survival. Oppenheimer would later say, "We have made a thing which has altered the nature of the world." From that point on, every breakthrough carried a new question, not just what science could build, but what it might someday destroy. 3. Physicists have known sin. After the war, Oppenheimer stopped speaking like a project leader and began speaking like a witness. The bomb had forced scientists into a role they had never occupied before, moral participants in mass destruction. This wasn't about regret alone. It was about a permanent change in what it meant to know something dangerous and still choose to pursue it. In his public lectures from the 1947, Oppenheimer says, "Physicists have known sin, and this is a knowledge which they cannot lose. They have become conscious of the possibility of evil inherent in their work. This is a new situation for science. It changes the relationship of science to society." Oppenheimer's use of the word sin wasn't religious, it was irreversible. Knowledge, once gained, cannot be unlearned. Science had crossed a threshold where discovery automatically carried consequence. From this point on, ignorance was no longer an option, and neutrality was no longer honest. Scientists were now accountable not just for truth, but for outcomes. 4. The chain reaction. Fear, risking everything. There is a lesser-known detail about the Manhattan Project that reveals just how close humanity came to catastrophe. Before Trinity, scientists openly debated whether the bomb could trigger a chain reaction in the atmosphere itself. The odds were low, but the fact that the question was even asked tells us something profound about the scale of risk they were accepting. Oppenheimer later reflected with regret. There was a question whether the atmosphere might ignite. The probability was small, but it was not zero. We were dealing with a situation that had never existed before. This wasn't recklessness, it was something new. For the first time, humans knowingly conducted an experiment with planetary consequences. Even a 1% chance of total annihilation had entered serious scientific discussion. In that moment, science became existential. The risk was no longer local, political, or military, it was absolute. 5. The hydrogen bomb, drawing a moral line. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, most people assumed the next step was obvious. If one bomb ended the war, then bigger bombs would keep the peace. More power meant more safety. That logic took hold quickly. But Oppenheimer didn't see it that way. When the idea of the hydrogen bomb came up, a weapon not just stronger, but unimaginably stronger, something shifted for him. This wasn't refinement, it wasn't deterrence, it felt like losing the thread completely, a point where science stopped solving problems and started creating ones no one could control. He said it plainly, the hydrogen bomb is a weapon of genocide. It is not a weapon which can be used in any rational way. I felt it was wrong to proceed. That's not fear talking, it's recognition. Oppenheimer understood that once destruction becomes total, strategy stops meaning anything. You can't plan around annihilation. You can't balance it. At that scale, there are no winners, only survivors, if you're lucky. This was the moment he changed. He stopped thinking like someone building tools and started thinking like someone watching a future unravel. The hydrogen bomb wasn't just another invention. It was a signal that science, left unchecked, could outrun the very people who created it. 6. International control or mutual destruction. By the late 1940s, the bomb was no longer just an American secret. Oppenheimer understood something many policymakers refused to accept. Nuclear weapons could not remain national tools without becoming global threats. Secrecy would fail, competition would accelerate, and an arms race would not end in victory, only survival or extinction. Oppenheimer's response came in the address on international control of atomic energy, and is one of the most prominent one till date. We are not only under the compulsion to save the world, but under the compulsion to make it possible to be saved. No nation can be secure alone. The peoples of this world must unite or they will perish. Oppenheimer's reflection was not driven by idealism, but it came from pure logic. He saw that once multiple nations held apocalyptic power, deterrence would become a permanent hostage situation. Peace would depend not on trust, but restraint. And restraint, without shared rules, was fragile. Science had outgrown borders, but politics hadn't caught up. 7. The security clearance. Hearing when caution became suspicion. There was one moment when Oppenheimer took a solid stance against the dangers of science. It was years later, sitting in a small room, answering questions about his loyalty. Because this time, the danger wasn't a bomb, it was what happened when science stopped asking hard questions and power stopped wanting honest answers. The hearing showed him something new, that even when scientists understand the risks, their voices can still be pushed aside. That knowledge alone isn't enough, and that once science becomes tied to fear and control, it doesn't just build weapons, it builds momentum that no single person can stop. This was the moment Oppenheimer realized something terrifying. Science doesn't end worlds all at once. Sometimes it does it quietly, by silencing the people who try to slow it down. By 1954, Oppenheimer wasn't just another scientist. He was the scientist people listened to. His security clearance mattered because it gave him access to meetings, to decisions, to the future of nuclear weapons. It meant his voice could still shape where the world was going. Then that access was taken away. Officially, the hearing was about loyalty, about whether he could be trusted. But that wasn't the real issue. The real problem was that Oppenheimer had started saying things people in power didn't want to hear. He questioned the hydrogen bomb. He warned against racing toward bigger and bigger weapons. And in a world driven by fear, slowing down looked suspicious. When he was questioned, he didn't apologize. He didn't retreat. I was not disloyal. I have been deeply concerned with the direction in which our policy is moving. I would do it again. Those words show how much he had changed. He had seen where science was leading, toward weapons so powerful they could wipe out entire civilizations. He realized that if no one spoke up, there would be no breaks at all. Losing his security clearance cost him everything that made his voice matter. He could still teach, he could still think, but he could no longer advise, no longer warn from inside the room where decisions were made. Did his stand stop the arms race? No, the world kept building, kept escalating. But that doesn't make what he did pointless, it makes it brave. Oppenheimer wasn't punished for doing something wrong. He was punished for caring enough to question where all this was headed, and for realizing that science without wisdom could lead us somewhere we might not survive. 8. The Oppenheimer Paradox. It's tempting to label J. Robert Oppenheimer as a hero or a villain, but his life doesn't fit neatly into either box, and that's what makes it uncomfortable. He helped unlock the most destructive force humanity has ever known, and once he understood what that force meant, he spent the rest of his life trying to slow things down, trying to make people think. Late in life, he said, in some sort of crude sense which no vulgarity, no humor, no overstatement can quite extinguish, the physicists have known sin. He wasn't talking about religion. He was talking about awareness, about the moment scientists realized their work could end the world. At the same time, Oppenheimer never turned against science itself. He believed in it deeply. It is not possible to be a scientist unless you believe that knowledge of the world is of great value. But he added something just as important, something many people wanted to ignore. But that knowledge carries responsibility. That's the paradox. Knowledge is priceless. It helps us understand the universe, cure diseases, and build the future. But once that knowledge becomes powerful enough to destroy everything, it stops being innocent. Oppenheimer didn't reject discovery. He rejected the idea that discovery comes without consequences. His life is a reminder that the biggest breakthroughs don't just change what we can do. They force us to decide who we want to be, and whether we're ready for the power we've created. 9. Science after Oppenheimer. The question still unanswered. Oppenheimer spent his final years looking beyond nuclear weapons. He understood that the bomb was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a pattern. Science would continue to accelerate. Power would grow more abstract, more automated, more detached from human consequence. The real danger, he believed, was not any single invention, but our failure to mature alongside our discoveries. The peoples of this world must unite or they will perish. We cannot stop the advance of science. What we can do is take responsibility for the world that science is creating. The responsibility of scientists is not only to discover, but to consider. That responsibility hasn't disappeared, it has multiplied. Artificial intelligence, biotechnology, autonomous weapons, each carries the same question Oppenheimer faced in 1945. Not can we build it, but should we? Science will always move forward. The only uncertainty left is whether human judgment will move fast enough to keep up. Oppenheimer didn't fear science. He feared what happens when it moves faster than our judgment. He watched knowledge turn into power, and power turn into something no one could put back in the box. That's the part we're still living with, because the real danger was never one bomb or one moment in history. It was the habit of building first and asking questions later. Science will keep going. The question is whether we'll learn to slow down long enough to think. If you like this video, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We bring you a fresh and new perspective to the most powerful science concepts ever. So don't forget to subscribe and tap that bell icon so you don't miss out on the latest videos.